Okay. Let me go to present here. All right. We see my screen?
Yes.
Awesome.
And Scott, just a reminder, this is a open source proposal.
Yeah. Sorry, this is
just making sure.
Yeah, this yes it is.
Okay.
The title is a little bit incorrect there. All right, so the goals of what I'm trying to do is support API management in Istio without being explicit about too much about how it's supported. So what I'm really looking for here is creating a vendor neutral, minimally opinionated way of handling the system of accepting an API description along with API policies and routes into the system, and allowing Istio to respond to that with different vendor backends and things like that, and still allowing the operator to control the low-level policy and authentication and authorization stuff. So let me get into that then. So I want to start off with what my definition of an API is, because I think there's a lot of definitions. In this case, what I'm saying is it's a named set of API operations, which are basically, you know, the endpoints in an API. So it's a group of that, and this API is accessible to a client via a certain set of credentials that is specific to a group, well, potentially a group of APIs or a single API. And the API operation that I just mentioned is just a HTTP or potentially gRPC request target. It's identified by host path and method. You can actually associate it with different API policies, and it's routed to some sort of endpoint within Istio or known to Istio. So here's just a basic relationship diagram of how that looks. And across the top, you see how authentication and API belongs to, or potential multiple APIs belongs to an API provider. To the right of that, you see API credentials are what gives access to the APIs. And I put in client application. I'm not really, it's not enforced, and it's not really a thing in Istio. It won't be a thing in Istio, but it's just an example of, this is the common pattern that a credential belongs to an application, and an application has access to multiple APIs, but you can drop application right out of there.
Actually, we're looking at adding applications in Istio as a first-class thing, and think of it as a group, the name you give to a group of related workloads.
Okay, so from the API standpoint, it doesn't care. It doesn't care if there's an application or not. Really, it's just a mapping of a credential to valid APIs. Also, policies can be applied to operations or to the entire API. And then there's routing that will actually allow you to specify that for a given API operation, it goes to a specific workload endpoint. Okay, so we're going to initially work on supporting two different API specifications. One is OpenAPI with some extensions so that we can read the information out of the OpenAPI and create the necessary structures inside of Istio. And the other thing would be to provide a set of extensions for gRPC so that the APIs could be specified there as well. So everybody may or may not be familiar with OpenAPI, but basically, in a nutshell, it's just a JSON or YAML specification. It's designed for both human and machine readable. So, and it's really designed around RESTful web services. It's not necessarily, it doesn't have to be RESTful exactly, but it also can't, it is limited in scope. It's not really designed for dynamic web services. But it does provide a good de facto industry standard. Pretty much everybody's aware of it and is using it as the standard these days. And it provides a nice, easy to understand basis for describing what an API is and provides extensions onto it. And I'll give examples as we go through here. So here's just a really simple example of a hello world. You can see it's broken down basically into some basic information about which version of OpenAPI it is, the information about the spec itself, the title, or the API itself, the title of the API, the expected endpoints of where it's going to be coming from the servers would be mapped to hello world. And then you can see it's a path, it's hello, a method get, it's an operation ID, and it basically, you just respond with a string. And on the right there, you can see how that might look in curl. Very simple, but it also allows you to specify like input validation and other things like that, which we're not going to get into right now. The policies. So now we're going to get into the actual extensions that I'm proposing. One of those is policies. So the way I'm proposing policies would be to basically map a name that's specified in your spec to some sort of underlying operation that an adapter that and handler that's been created inside of Istio. And that is, so right now you would not specify how the policy operates itself inside of the API specification, just that it should be applied. And what would happen then is the rules that are generated when this is ingested would map saying that if this operation is called, call these policies. And that would be the entirety of the mapping and the creation of these policies. And you can see here, we have like an example policy, daily quota, and we say that it should be applied for the hello path in a hello world operation. And you can have, you can apply these policies at the path level or at the API level again.
You have up above, you have one called daily quota per application. Down below,
yeah,
daily quota. Should that match?
That's a typo. They should.
Okay, so that should actually match.
It should be a match, yeah.
And then, is there an assumption?
Well, actually, I take that back. In this case, that's actually two different things. Sorry, I misspoke. So the one above is actually for the API as a whole. The one below would be for the that specific path, that specific operation.
Okay.
So you can declare them in two different spots.
I see. But this name will appear somewhere else. I see.
Right. So the name itself, the daily quota or must have, llama header, those are actually created in Istio by the operator.
And presumably you could have must have header, and then you could pass the parameter header name equals llama or something like that. Yes, or is that too complicated?
That would have to be a separate rule.
Okay, maybe some other time then.
Yeah, I mean we could. I mean we can talk about that as to whether or not that would be a good idea. How much of a language we should bring into the OpenAPI.
Okay.
Okay. Next, routing. routing works similarly. Basically, for a destination, you need a host port and path. So those can be specified. Sorry, I should start at the top. The servers. So we want to be able to map to a gateway, because we're basically creating a virtual service. So the gateway itself, the main gateway, should be already created by the operator. So that's under the operator control. But we want to map to that gateway and attach this. So anything incoming to the helloworld.com or the Hello World gateway would be affected by this virtual service. The second part is the actual destination for the workload, or the endpoint, I should say. You can specify a host port and path, and this works like a virtual service also, in the sense that it'll take whatever the path. So helloworld.com/hello will go to, you'll see it'll be routed to hello workload, port 5000, and a path of /hello world.
So, one thing that worries me a little bit about this is that it seems to be blending the semantic definition of what an API is with an implementation of that API.
Well, it depends on what you mean by implementation.
Well, the specific ports and service names are the implementation of the semantics of an API, right? I could have two completely orthogonal endpoints that expose the same API.
Yes. So what this allows, so the purpose of this is to actually separate the implementation from the API. And that is, I want to define an API that's not dependent on any of the backend workloads. But I need to specify what those workloads are.
Yeah.
And we don't want to map them against anything that already exists in the system of services, because, well, I'll touch on this a little bit later, but for a given incoming host and path, you could have different APIs that actually apply to that, depending on your access, depending on your particular credentials.
Yeah.
So
well, I guess I was just wondering if, like, the X APIM destination stanza, if that should actually be separate from the rest of the definition.
Yeah.
At least optionally, so I can use the same API definition with multiple potential hosts.
Yeah. So there's two ways of looking at it. One is an API has multiple, I guess, versions is one way to look at it.
Or instantiation.
Or instantiation. Yeah, right. The other way to look at it is an API is that, right? So in Apigee, at least, we had the idea that a host and a path was the API, right? Or was, where you're going to on the API, and then you could branch off of that based on your credentials. This kind of inverts that a little bit, in that the API is more than the host and the path. It's also the credentials. So by the time you get to the point of choosing which API it is, you've already chosen the route that you're going to on the back end. And so I can have an API that has like a gold level and a silver level, and it's the same. It may or may not be the same set of paths and host, but depending on who you are coming into the system, you may go to completely different endpoints on the back end.
Yeah.
So
So the model I'm thinking is more along the lines of, say, I've got some friends that run their own Minecraft servers.
right.
Doesn't matter which Minecraft server you run, they all support the same API and they're at different endpoints.
Oh, okay. I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Right, so in that context, you want to define the semantics of this is what it looks to be a Minecraft server, but you can instantiate it multiple times at different places on the internet.
Right. So the thought here was that I was going to leave that to the virtual service. So a virtual service can do that kind of routing, correct? So that if you specify, you're specifying a host and a port and a path, but that's not necessarily the final destination either, right? Because Istio can still control it after that. Or you can do it through rules.
Okay, I can see.
At some point we have to actually route it somewhere.
Yeah.
I mean, it could be a separate document, but
okay, but you're saying so
it wouldn't add any value here.
So this would route to what does it say here? So hello workload, and then you could put a virtual service there to route to the actual physical thing that's on your cluster.
Right.
Okay, I can see how that works.
So the only thing on this, and we can take it offline, but would that be that the host name and port number might be, something that changes in different deployment scenarios, so that would need to be overwritable. But that's something to look at later.
Well, so I guess that's why I was going. So either
Right.
make it overwritable and replaceable, or you just say, no, that's always where it routes, and you need to stick something there that's doing the redirection.
Yeah, that's true. Within a mesh, as Scott says, it wouldn't matter. Yeah, so there you go.
Right. That was my hope, that we wouldn't have to do templating or anything else on this, and that instead you would route based on some sort of virtual service or other rules.
Okay, so I think it's worthwhile keeping this as an issue to see from a usability standpoint what it looks like.
Yep.
Scott, one quick question. This OpenAPI spec which I'm authoring, this is not the OpenAPI spec I would necessarily show in a developer portal, right? Because it contains some implementation details. So
yes,
so wouldn't
absolutely.
providers have to maintain sort of two sets or two versions of the API spec?
You could do that, or you could filter.
Yeah, I think there's a productive set of tools that need to eventually be built around spec composition and decomposition, but that's another thing.
Yeah.
So are the extensions schematized enough so that we could systematically strip them if we wanted to?
Yeah. And all of that is outside of the scope of what we're talking about. I'm not talking about adding any kind of portals or anything else to Istio. This is really just implementation of how
Right, I
an API is exposed.
Understood. I think it's good to ask those questions, not because we're going to implement that portal necessarily, but because people who are using OpenAPI specs are probably using it for that too. And understanding that flow and making sure that we're not screwing it up will be important.
Yeah.
Do you have
this could be a separate file.
So here's the question I was going to ask: do you have you've summarized this file in slides now? Right?
Oh, Dan, your voice completely.
I couldn't hear that.
Yeah.
Try this microphone.
No,
You have-
still same problem.
A file that you can show us with this whole with all this stuff in one file. Maybe.
Use sign language, Dan.
Start at the beginning. Ask your question again.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I can hear you right now. Yes.
Can you show us this all in one file? We've seen half of this file on two different slides. Do you have it in a text editor?
No.
Okay.
Not right now. It's but it's also I don't have all one file.
Okay.
Sorry.
That's all right.
Good point. I should do that. It's hard to display all of that at once. Let me move on. The next thing is authentication. So OpenAPI already has built-in support for specifying some authentication. And so that's what you see here is basically almost all of this is standard OpenAPI. It includes security schemes and where they should be applied. The only thing that I've added here is on the bottom right over here. You can see there's a X API policy where you can specify some of the information that you need for like for the JOT token to get the issuer and the JWorks URI, which is something that we support in Istio directly. And then also which claims coming from that could be used for API key to use or the authorized set of APIs for that particular token.
So it's worth pointing out you're modeling API keys like JOTs effectively.
Well, in this case, this would be from a JOT. The API key itself, you see above that, you can also pull API keys directly out of the request.
Okay, but we talked previously about having claims coming out of API keys as well, right?
Right. Yes. Yes. So right now, claims can come out of JOTs. Claims can come out of the OIDC, and there will be a simple API to allow you to exchange an API key for a set of claims. And that would be just an endpoint that you would specify.
Okay.
Right, so the idea is that the second form here is kind of a superset of the first form, right? If you're doing JOT auth, if the JOT is valid, you're looking for a claim called API key, and then you're doing the same thing you do if it was an API key to see if that key is authorized to make that particular API call, right?
Yes, yes. Or you could potentially bypass it with the authorized set, because the core of what the API key verification endpoint would do is return a set of authorized APIs.
Okay.
Like, this key has access to these APIs.
So the idea is trying to figure out exactly what's going to happen because of these different things.
If you're going to talk about flow, I'm getting there.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. All right. So this is just an overview of kind of how the ingestion works, right? So you submit your OpenAPI CR or some gRPC CR into the API server. That gets processed by Galley, and then it gets spit out in a whole bunch of different configurations for HTTP API specs, policy CRs, and rules, right? That end up in Mixer and Pilot and get processed by the auth policies and such. So what happens is that Galley generates some of these entities. It generates virtual services, authentication policy, some sort of API identification handler, and route directives. Now that API identification handler is what, maybe it doesn't generate the handler. It may have the endpoint to it, and route directives. And we'll see that in a minute. The API references some of the underlying things by name, as we talked about. So for authentication, the API key is reference a policy. So you have this daily quota. Gateway, you've specified a hello gateway and some sort of destination. All of those are created by the operator. And so it's just a name reference. And then, as I say here, so the operator actually defines those things. And then Galley will generate the glue as part of that. So it generates the instance and the rules so that those get called appropriately.
So can you go back to the flow diagram you had a couple slides before?
Oh, this one?
Yeah. So the implication here in that flow is that the operator is creating these high-level CRs, so the OpenAPI spec, and the lower-level stuff that is consumed by Mixer and Pilot do not necessarily materialize as resources in Kubernetes. Right, so in other words, you're going to create a virtual service, but that's not necessarily by creating a virtual service resource. It could be by just programming the virtual service directly in Pilot.
Right. Well, okay.
Right, so the other model, if you had an arrow that kind of loops back here, would say that the user is pushing this high-level resource. Magically, a bunch of lower-level resources pop out in the API server, and then everything else works normally.
So would that model require us to actually edit or alter the user-altered configs?
No, it would be an operator, right? Then, Martin, you would have an operator that when we receive the high-level one, we generate the lower-level ones.
Yeah, so in that pattern, you work just like when you create a deployment object and it creates pods for you.
Right, I understand the basic model. Is there any space for conflict between the user-altered one and the generated one?
I don't think so. I mean, well, potentially you could have name collisions and such, I suppose.
Yeah, so if you're targeting the same backend, maybe virtual service.
Yeah, so if the user's already created a virtual service that this thing's going to try and create, then you're going to run into trouble.
So the benefit there, I guess, Martin, is that the API server would contain the definitive version of what's going on. Whereas if we did exactly what is here, the information that Pilot has and the information that Mixer has wouldn't directly be contained in the API server. Is that right?
Correct. So in theory, let's say there's a bug in the transformation logic, and we produce some objects that are failing. The fact that you're exposing it into the API server gives a place for Istio to report status. And this virtual service that was created by API management is kaput for these reasons.
Do we have an established best practice for this? Is that preferable?
The official Kubernetes pattern would be to go and create these sub-resources, these derived resources in the API server.
Okay.
The problem is then they're first-class resources. The user can go and muck with them, delete them, and that kind of stuff. And it's also pollution to a certain extent, right? The user does not want to deal with this virtual service shit. He just wants to create with the CR at the top level, and we're polluting their space with these derivative stuff. So maybe that's where you put labels on the objects so the user can filter out the generated things and that kind of stuff.
Okay. Yeah, definitely point taken on that.
So I think we need to vet it out more broadly, seeing should we just follow the standard Kubernetes pattern of, because then in theory, you could do the entire OpenAPI transformation outside of Galley, and then just kind of explode it to all the resources that Galley does ingest.
So maybe I'm slightly misunderstood how Galley itself works. The standard pattern for Galley is to go from the API server back out into API server CRDs, and it just keeps track then of what was original and what's new, so it can do that again.
No, so the Galley does not do that right now. So
Okay.
Galley ingests the API server and then spits out protos over MCP to the downstream stuff.
Okay.
So I
that's that. Okay.
I think if you can make the argument that there's no potential for conflict with the user-altered config anywhere, then doing the generation in Galley makes sense, right? Because you're just creating an isolated scope of configuration where you're generating these configurations into, right?
Yeah, it becomes an implementation detail. The fact that to achieve this functionality, we have to generate these sub-resources is of no concern to the user.
Exactly, right?
Yeah, I think that's almost never the case.
You think it is of concern to the user?
I think, well, yeah. I mean, it very well could be, because certainly there could be interaction of these things with other things. I mean, that you're generating the same kinds of things that the operator is, right?
Okay.
And you're mixing them. So yeah.
So I think then the right implementation for this model would be to have a standalone API management controller that reads the API management related resources and just writes back to the API server the underlying stuff. And that's where it stops. And then Galley will read the underlying stuff and deliver that to the rest of the system.
Okay. So we need to write a desired state engine.
Yeah, effectively. And yeah, the thing needs to go the other way as well and look at the underlying resources and decide, oh, my OpenAPI spec has bogus status or has a failed status because one of the underlying things has failed.
Right.
Both ways.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. That sounds like something probably need to detail out as some sort of best practice pattern for doing this kind of thing in Istio.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's a Kubernetes thing, and this move towards CRDs plus operators is something that's going on industry wide. It's relatively nascent. I think it's all really come about in the last year, but it's also huge deal. We should talk to Tim Hawken about best practices. He's a huge advocate.
Well, we also I guess does this affect anything with Istio's independence from Kubernetes?
Well, I was just thinking about that. So all it means is Galley will be able to ingest all the low-level primitives, including the HTTP API spec, and you'll be able to pump that directly through an MCP port as input to Galley. So, so it's divorced from the API server. What is tied to the API server in this world would be you need logic to read your high-level CR and the logic to push the lower-level CR. That transformation would be in a Kubernetes-specific component.
Okay.
However,
ideally, we package that in a way that people, if you want to be on console and do this on console, maybe you can reuse some of our core transformation packages, but you wrap it into your own console to MCP service instead.
Right, exactly. Ultimately, the transformation logic is the same. It's just that state machine that watches the API server and spits out the new things. It's the state machine would change per platform, but the logic is the same.
Right. Yeah. So I think that's my fault. I misunderstood what Galley was. I thought that's what it was.
Close, but not quite. All right.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Okay. So I touched on this a second ago. The API identification itself. So APIs can have overlapping hosts and paths. Gold and Silver can share a host and some paths, but have separate ones. And then we discriminate between the credentials. So host path and credentials. The consequences of that is that we have to do the authentication authorization for the API before API selection. So basically the way it's going to happen then, or the way I'm proposing anyway, is that the APIs would be basically merged down by host into essentially what is a virtual service to target for the authentication. And then the final API operation would be selected from the list of authorized APIs by path. So what that really means is that for any given host, you can't have APIs. You can't issue credentials that have access to multiple APIs that share the paths. So a given credential must have a set of APIs that are distinguishable in path and host. Sorry, I don't know if I made that clear or made it clear as mud.
This part is confusing. Can you go back one slide? APIs may have overlapping hosts and paths.
So in the case, for example, where talk about the gold and silver, they may be on the same host and they may have the same paths, right? But you're going to issue to a given client a credential to one or the other, not both.
And this indicates, yeah, this is a strange concept. Nandan started to talk to me about this yesterday, and this is a strange concept to me. So even if the paths are all identical, it's the same API. We just have different, say, quota levels at gold and silver.
Yeah, I mean, the Apogee product has the concept of an API product for this, and in here, this is combining the concept of an API product with it's just an API. Right.
The question, right. So again, that goes back to the definition of an API. If you believe the definition of an API is really just host and path, then it doesn't fit that. It's actually more than that. And that allows you to have multiple APIs that share host and path, but have actual different operations to them.
Right.
And different policy.
I think it strikes me as confusing. I get it, but there's like a cognitive dissonance there. I don't know if anyone else feels that, or if it's just my small mind.
I think it's just a matter of habit. If you start thinking about it this way, this actually makes a lot of sense in my mind. I've gotten used to this at this point. Right. So
I think this is a simpler model, in my opinion.
So it says, look, based on the credentials you present, you're going to get different. The shape of the API you can consume is different. That's all.
And the policies around it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is what you want, right? So you're a gold customer, you're a silver customers. You'll have different policies, maybe different operations. Some operations don't exist in one and exist in the other.
Yeah. Okay. I get it. I'm just wondering if the name API, if people will find that confusing, because I don't think that commonly, and this is I mean, anecdotally, it's not the first thing I think of. I don't know who else, other people who haven't talked at all. If you want to say how you feel about this, does this feel weird, or does this feel understandable?
I understand this for whatever it's worth, but I hope I was along for the full ride, so I'm not sure that really counts. So.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I'm looking for people who weren't involved in the design process.
Sure. Right.
I think that is absolutely a critical discussion to have, because
and it's kind of a naming discussion, right? Fundamentally, it's just
naming is hard.
Right. And I'm worried here we've chosen a name that people already have a lot of connotations, associated with.
It could be.
So you mean the name API? That's
right. If you ask someone, hey, if this API, if it has the exact same surface, but one person can call it 10 times a month and one person can call it 20 times a month, are those two APIs or one?
Right.
So, same surface, same URL, same everything. Just the policy differs. Do people think of that as a different API?
The thing is, it can be more than just that differs. It can actually be the set of operations as well.
I understand.
Yeah. And
it's saying that the API is the interface. When we talk about the interface, we mean not just the surface, but the policy. That's what we're saying, right?
Well, the only weird thing also is, as the consumer of an API, if you signed up for the Spanner API, and whether you get a lot of Spanner or a little bit of Spanner, it's still the Spanner API.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the Spanner API, but I only paid for a slow Spanner, or I paid for fast Spanner. So if this is just distinguishing like quota, it might be confusing to the end user, but if it's distinguishing, it's a different collection of things, that's a different story.
Right. Because it could be both, right?
Yeah, that's
so the gold API could have additional endpoints to it that the silver doesn't.
Right.
And we certainly see use cases for that.
Yeah, we see that all the time in the enterprise. You know, I want to offer each of my partners their own individual API under the covers. It's all the same thing.
Right.
So the idea was to simplify it, but it sounds like the simplification, the idea of the simplification is confusing itself.
Possibly. I mean, if we evaluate something that would allow you to, create one API with multiple policies, say API policy, we would have to call it, and let you choose those separately. Maybe we end up with a more complicated design. We wouldn't like it more. I can't say no. This is not good.
Right. Yeah. So the idea was to kind of denormalize it into the API itself.
Right.
But yeah.
Okay, so maybe we went a little too far.
I think we should look at it and actually look at a couple of implementations. Just take a simple. We have a gold and we have a silver, and they have slightly different policies, or they have different services and policies. Here's how it would look under the current proposal. If we change proposal to have a new thing called API policy, then here's how it would look. And fundamentally just look at what the config would look like and what the differences would be. I think that's what will tell us. Whichever one of those sets of config makes us want to throw up less is probably better. Just wants to make me throw up a little bit.
Okay.
The Vomit index. That's what we need. Yes.
Okay. So all right, we need to go back and explore this a little bit more. The nice thing about doing it the other way that you're proposing is actually it's simpler, as you'll see here. This is basically a byproduct of the way doing it this way. So we have some sort of virtual service that it comes into as a host. So example.com, /hello. We get the claim, actually not raw claims. We just get request auth claims or the API key. We have some sort of verification of that, right? And then that gives us the list of authorized APIs. So now we identify which API it is that we're calling. We set that API. That sets the route selection based on the extensions that I said. We replace the route based on that, and then allow Istio to go ahead and do its routing at that point. The regular routing, whatever the operator has already set for that host port path. Anyone? Okay, let me go on, because it gets more fun. And I think we've already talked through.
This is the confusing one. Yeah.
So right, but I think we've already talked through all of this. So this is the same thing as what I just showed you.
Well, actually, the concept is probably important. I think where we all got stuck was on the name API.
Right.
Because the idea of different policies for the same set of backend services with the same hosts and paths is something we're going to have to support.
Yes. Right. One way or another, yeah, it has to be supported that way. And so theoretically, too, what I'm proposing here could support either one. If we go the other direction, we really are locked into a more normalized view of things. But let's move forward. So again, here we have a request comes in. We authenticate the credentials, right? We authorize those APIs, and then we select an API.
And
that's why I just
can a credential be authorized for multiple APIs? Of course.
Yes.
Yes. So what if it's authorized for both A and B? A gold and silver, that is.
It can't be. So that would be an error.
But I could have this, like I might have a different API, my foo API, and I use the same credential to call my foo API.
I hope so.
Yes, absolutely. So the idea was, again, it goes back to host and path. As long as you don't have overlapping host and path, you can have as many APIs, access to as many APIs as you want. They just, that set of APIs has to be distinguishable by host and path, which API it is that you're going to actually hit.
Okay.
So you're basically what it is, your credentials say which potential APIs you can hit, then we select based on host and path.
You could actually, the list of APIs associated with a credential could actually be an ordered list, in theory, right?
Yeah, it could be.
And then
Yeah,
you pick
so-
the first one that matches.
Yeah.
I don't know if
You're
that
right.
helps or makes things worse.
No, I think it would be fine to say that there's an order and you just pick the first.
So we don't have a
it just-
ton of. Sorry, I'm going to be
Ordered
obnoxious.
by what?
Well,
Well,
ordered by whatever the user has added them in it's
In the credential.
it's a YAML, right? So whatever they're listed in the
Yeah.
YAML file or something.
We don't have
In
a
the
ton of time for this meeting left.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear from some of the non-Googlers what they think of this. Because some of us have had a chance to see this before.
I am basically done. So yeah, go ahead. Anybody has?
Hello,
Maybe-
non-Googlers.
I'm curious to know what Edith thinks. And maybe she's afraid to say, I hate it.
No. It's not I'm afraid at all. I'm doing parallel of a lot of things. I probably
Okay.
want to re-watch it before I'm saying my opinion.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I'm glad to-
We're in touch, right? I can totally call you.
Okay. Yeah, I am particularly curious to get feedback on it.
No worries. I would love to. But again, it's just like I need to write the release. It's horrible. Don't try to.
Yeah, right now, end of the year is not the best time to make final decisions on this. But I did want to get it out there so that we could start thinking about these things.
Okay, so thank you, Scott. I'll try and post this to YouTube for everybody else to see, and if you could follow up with the issues on the mailing list, and hopefully we'll go from there.
Yep. Or feel free to contact me directly too for specific questions.
Yeah, thanks for doing it. I think it's great to have a proposal that we can start to throw rocks at, and there weren't very big rocks. For the most part, I think it covers the things that we need to cover.
Awesome. I got some good feedback, so I appreciate it.
See you guys later.
All right.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.